Hi, and welcome to Nitpicks on Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone if you're in the UK. Rather than a conventional book review, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into some of the more nuanced elements in the book and talking about them at length. If you're a creative writer yourself, I think you'll find this video to be of particular interest, as I will be pointing out both advantages and some of the pitfalls of the book in a line-by-line fashion. While I will talk about the story as a whole from time to time, I am more interested in nuts and bolts of the sentences and the paragraph structure, the decisions behind what content is included, why, and to what benefit or detriment it serves. If you're not a creative writer, never fear, as I hope you'll find these comments to be useful in your future reading experiences. And to be clear, I'm not intending to make the case that Harry Potter is a bad book or anything. Rather, I am leaving you my thoughts and musings as I was rereading it. So, this isn't an entirely scripted analysis. I'm going to be riffing off of my notes mostly. And on that subject, I should mention that while I never grew up reading Harry Potter, I've been a huge fan of it ever since my rather awkward entry. I actually started with the 5th film and was completely lost, but I liked it. From there, I kept up with the films, and once that had resolved, went back and read the books. It's been a few years since I've read them and wanted to give them a reread. In a way, I can see how you might find my points of criticism to be trivial. I don't have the same attachment that others have with it as this intimate part of my childhood. However, I've been reading and writing in this genre since I was 10, and in spite of all my gripes, Harry Potter remains among the best in fantasy literature. It's because the series is so good that I'm putting in the effort to make this video in the first place. Naturally, I'll be talking about passages as if you've read them, and in a few cases I'll be referencing the film adaptation as well. So if you're not familiar with the books or the film, I suggest experiencing at least one of them before you watch this video, as you might be a bit lost otherwise. And besides, it's a good series worth your time if you have yet to experience it. Anyways, I hope you find my thoughts insightful or enjoyable, both when the book shines and when it doesn't. Let's take a look. Starting with Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived, the first thing I want to point out is the contrast between the descriptions for Mr. Dursley and Dumbledore. Mr. Dursley gets about 2 lines. Dumbledore, on the other hand, gets an entire paragraph dedicated to him, with the last line introducing his name as a bit of finality to it. This is a good choice overall, I think, since Dumbledore is going to play a hugely significant role in the story. Dumbledore has never had a lot of resonance for me personally. I don't dislike him, but I've always been more interested in the child characters, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. So seeing how he is introduced was a reminder to me as I was rereading that he is a huge part of the story, and it's nice to see him given such a lengthy paragraph as his opening. Moving along a little bit further, we'll notice the first mention of candy, which is going to be an ongoing theme with this book. In this case, it's a lemon drop. Innocent enough, but I did want to mention it because we're going to be seeing a lot of it going forward. That said, I do really like this moment here where Professor McGonagall says, "No, thank you," coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. That was a nice touch. And of course, we get to the end of the chapter, which ends with "To Harry Potter, the Boy Who Lived," which is of course the title of Chapter 1. I don't know how I feel about these in general. I think on the whole, I usually don't like it when they connect back and you have, a line, a phrase from the chapter, in reference to the chapter title itself. It just seems like the chapter title should be about the content, but an overt reference to me feels less ideal, I guess. That said, I think I prefer it here simply because Chapter 1 is almost like a prologue for the book. Harry is just a baby, so we're really following the Dursleys and then Dumbledore and McGonagall. There's no clear protagonist yet. I mean, we know it's Harry Potter, but he's not really functional in that way yet. So to have it self-contained like this and have it loop in on itself, the chapter, just tied off in a nice bow, I think works really well for it. Rather than having a prologue, you're able to use Chapter 1 and kind of isolate it from the rest of the book. Moving on to Chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass. I don't have too many things to say about this chapter. It's pretty good, but I do love this line right here. It's probably my favorite line in the whole book, where Uncle Vernon turns around and yells at Harry in the backseat, "Motorcycles don't fly!" That part just cracks me up. Like, why does he have to be so upset? Like, it is just a dream, as Harry points out, but the fact that it just really grates on his skin, he's got to hammer home, like, That's not how things work in real life, just shut up. It's just, it cracks me up every time. Now, since this is a birthday party, it does make sense to have sweets here, the large chocolate ice creams. But again, I'm going to point it out anyways because that's 2 chapters in a row now, and there's only more to come. Chapter 3, The Letters from No One. I love this part here where Harry gets his letter and it says, the cupboard under the stairs. The fact that the envelope has to specify precisely where he is, as if that's his house, I thought was great. I think part of the reason why it works so good is the fact that it's so oddly specific where you wouldn't expect it to be. I mean, that's what makes a good joke, right? When it's very, very specific and unpredictable. Getting into chapter 4, I like this moment right here where Harry suggests, could you write it down? And Hagrid goes, nah, I can't spell it. All right, Voldemort. And he's so reluctant to say it. But at the suggestion of writing it down, it's well, forget it. I'll just have to say it. I just got to do it because it's not going to work if I write it down. It'll just be a mess. I thought that was a good way to bring in some humor, even though he's trying to talk about something very serious. Even when Hagrid is talking about something serious, it still comes across as funny. A little bit further into the chapter, we'll see this moment here where Uncle Vernon says, load of old tosh, and then Harry jumped. He had almost forgotten that the Dursleys were there. Because the reader probably forgot about them too, I suspect. Except that won't be the case as an adult reader. As a kid, you might. But it's the kind of phrase that I don't think is worded in a way that really adds much to the conversation. It's supposed to make you startled by the fact that the Dursleys are still there, or if you had forgotten about them, then it's oh yeah, that's true. They're kind of lingering in the back of your mind. But you don't really have to jump at it. It seems like it's an overreaction, and I guess what I should say is offer a suggestion for a way you could word this differently. So what I would suggest is to just say, Harry jumped. Uncle Vernon certainly seemed to have got back his courage, and just take out that middle part. Leave the semicolon, that way you get the impression of Harry being startled by them being there, but we don't have to sit through an entire sentence just to get that information across. It would overall make it a bit tighter, I think. Now, when I make suggestions like that, you don't have to take it to heart that I think it's a bad book or that this is somehow a horrible bit of writing just because of it. Mostly what I'm trying to point out is if you're a creative writer yourself and you notice yourself doing that kind of thing, you have the option to kind of see where, yeah, maybe I don't need to have this extra phrase because it doesn't really add a whole lot. Unless, of course, you're writing for kids, which she definitely was in this case. So it's not a harsh criticism, but when you're writing for an audience that's a little bit more mature, the almost forgotten, the presence of something else in play, and then having to remind the reader that it's there is a little bit patronizing and doesn't really add much to the conversation. I do love this line up here, though. I'm not paying for some crackpot old fool to teach them magic tricks. Mr. Dursley is just... he's great. I love him. Next up is Chapter 5, Diagon Alley. This moment right here is a really nice contrast between the ordinary and extraordinary worlds. Hagrid is reading, the Daily Prophet, which is a newspaper, which is ordinary, and reading the paper is a very ordinary thing to do, but the Daily Prophet is extraordinary, and Ministry of Magic is very extraordinary, but messing things up as usual, the government and what they're doing, it's just a mess. It's a very nice blend of the two, and it makes the world of Harry Potter feel both fun, relational, and just with that little bit of magic at the same time. This part right here, where Hagrid takes Harry into the Leaky Cauldron, is a little bit overdone, I think, and I think it'll be apparent as I read through it. It just seems like there's far too many lines in here to explain what she's trying to communicate. It goes like this. It was a tiny, grubby-looking pub. If Hagrid hadn't pointed it out, Harry wouldn't have noticed it was there. The people hurrying by didn't glance at it. Their eyes slid from the bookshop on one side to the record shop on the other, as if they couldn't see the Leaky Cauldron at all. And then she goes on, in fact, Harry had the most peculiar feeling that only he and Hagrid could see it. Before he could mention this, Hagrid had steered him inside. It's like, all right, yeah, I get it. Like, this is obviously a place that you can't see, if you're a muggle, you gotta be a magic person. It's just way too many lines to communicate that. I mean, rather than describe the building of what it looks like, she spends all this time trying to communicate the optical illusion that's happening, and it just felt a little long-winded to me. Once again, another reference to sweets, this time chocolate and raspberry with chopped nuts. Sounds pretty good. Candy entry number 5. He had never had any money for candy with the Dursleys, and now that he had pockets rattling with gold and silver, he was ready to buy as many Mars bars as he could. But the woman didn't have Mars bars. What she did have were Birdie's, Bots, every flavor beans, Drubel's best blowing gum, chocolate frogs, pumpkin pasties. Alright, so this is all fine because now we're getting into like magic candy, but it's still candy, so we're still going to count it. I like this moment up here where Harry gets the card, the collecting card, and it's Dumbledore. And he turns it over and he's like, hey, he's gone. And then Ron's like, well, we can't expect him to hang around all day. He'll be back. I thought that was great because, Dumbledore isn't actually like sitting in a chair, projecting his face onto the card and then like, oh, okay, I better get up and do something else. And like, every like around the clock, every couple hours, he's got to go over and sit down and can just sit there for a minute or two so everybody has a chance to see his face. I mean, that's ridiculous, especially because you can get cards of people who are dead. So we know that this isn't actually what the characters are doing, but it's hilarious nonetheless. Getting into Chapter 6, this will be the 6th reference we have to candy. Not candy specifically this time, it's just dinner and dessert. But nevertheless, every chapter we got to get at least one mention in there to make sure that the kids are pleased and excited over the prospect of eating good food and sweets. Now for the Potions Master. First thing I want to point out here is how Peeves, the poltergeist, shows up and grabs your nose and screeches, "Gotcha, conk!" And I'm not going to explain that joke. I think we all know what it is, but thought I'd point it out anyways. Not just for the kids, huh? If I had to pick one line that really just I just can't let go, it just drives me crazy throughout the whole series, it's this one right here. There was a lot more to magic, as Harry quickly found out, than waving your wand and saying a few funny words. Except this is exactly what you do. Like, literally throughout the books, all the characters do is wave their wands and say a few funny words. There's very few exceptions where magic gets like a deeper explanation and, the universe is explained a little bit more. There's a few spells later on that get more of an elaborate description and some lore, like the Patronus charm that has some more depth to it. But by and large, characters just wave their wand and say funny words. I don't know why this line is here, because it's completely misleading to how the universe is actually going to play out in the rest of the books. And I recognize that, this is more of a personal thing. Like, I want to read a book that's just super in-depth with its world design and the way that magic works. That's like what I'm interested in reading, and I get that that wasn't really the intent of Harry Potter, but it was rich enough to where it could have been in that realm, especially when it does tap into it from time to time. So it's just a frustrating line for me to come across because it's completely hypocritical. And this part is almost as bad. The class everyone had been really looking forward to was Defense Against the Dark Arts. It's like even Rowling knew how interesting this subject was going to be for us. So why, in the first 2 books, is it just a bit of a joke, as she says? Like, Defense Against the Dark Arts is only really interesting in a couple of the books, and yet she plays it up in this one as like, oh, this is the one that students are most excited for. That's the one us as the audience are then going to be most excited for. And then it has to turn into a joke. Chapter 9, The Midnight Duel. Now, I gotta say, for this chapter, the title really irks me because there's no midnight duel in it, so it's completely false advertising. I mean, all that happens is the characters like run around the castle and get lost, and they run into Fluffy and whatnot, but they don't actually face off in a duel. So, before, where it was like, oh, the class that you're most interested in is Defense Against the Dark Arts, combat magic, and you're like, yeah, and then it's like, oh, but it turns out to be, kind of worthless. It's like, oh, okay. And then to have the next chapter be like the Midnight Duel and be like, oh, we're going to get a wizard duel. Like, awesome. That sounds great. And then to not deliver that again, Ah. But what you do get is more candy. A piece of steak and kidney pie. Gotta get those sweets in. Alright, let's move on to Halloween. Harkening back to what I was saying earlier, Wingardium Leviosa, he shouted, waving his long arms like a windmill. So, it's exactly like waving your wand and saying a few funny words, isn't it? But that aside, I like the characterization that happens here. I like how they're like kids at a playground and Hermione's saying, you're saying it wrong. It's Wingardium Leviosa. Make the gar nice and long. And then Ron getting all upset. You do it then if you're so clever. They just feel like real kids to me. So I do like the moment nonetheless. I also like how Ron calls the troll pea-brain. It sounds like something he would say, only something that Ron would say, not Hermione or Harry. For Chapter 11, a bigger focus I'll be talking about is the portrayal of gender in Harry Potter. Mostly this book, because it does vary from book to book a little bit. But I think Harry Potter gets praised a lot for what it says about gender and for the way it contributes to it. And I have to say that I find myself disagreeing with those sentiments more often than not. And there's a few examples in here that I'll point out why. So the first point to mention is this part right here where, Wood says, okay, men and women, said Chaser Angelina Johnson, and women would agree, this is it. And it's an instance where I feel like self-defense is less significant than straight-up inclusion. Like, come on, Wood. Like, he didn't, think to say something that would be more universal. Okay, team. I mean, even guys in some communities that sort of like works to just be an all-encompassing phrase. But like men is never used to refer to just like women also. So it's like he knew what he was doing. Like, he must have been really out of it in order for me to believe that he was like, not conscious of the fact that he has women on his team. I mean, unless that's the point of it. The point is like, he just doesn't see gender. It's just he's completely blind to it. I mean, I guess that could work, but it's more like it seems to me that there wants to be a big point that you have women on the team. And I feel like there should just be women on the team and they should be characters. And instead of just saying, making a point that, hey, I put women on the Quidditch team, like, who cares? Like, if you want women on the team, make them significant characters. Make them like Hermione or Luna or somebody who's really important to the story. That would have a much greater impact on showing women in sports as opposed to just flat out saying like, hey, I put 2 female characters on the team, even though they're not significant. I mean, both female characters on the Quidditch team, I never remember their names or who they are, because Fred and George and Wood and Harry are obviously far more important characters. And this next part here, we have the announcer saying, oh, what an excellent chaser that girl is, and rather attractive too. Jordan, sorry, Professor. And it's like, we're in the middle of a Quidditch game, and the announcer has to make note of the fact that, like, oh, well, she's very attractive. And it's like, come on, like, she's trying to play the game. Like, do you have to make mention of the fact that she's a girl? Like, leave her alone. Like, she's trying to, like, concentrate on, like, the competition here. And the mention of it, I mean, because this is, like, everybody can hear it, right? And so it just felt really rude. Like, Professor McGonagall is right to call him out on it, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. Like, I mean, he shouldn't even have that position. Like, I guess the joke is funny, like, I get it, but I also feel like if we're going to talk about how sensitive, the books are in accordance with gender, I really don't see how that argument holds up when you have things like this happen. Anyways, let's get on to Chapter 12, The Mirror of Arised. I do like this part here. I think it's funny that the note says, use it well. It's not use wisely. It's like, no, just use it well. Like, it's not like, be careful, kid, son, use it wisely. It's like, no, just use it, but do a good job with it. Like, whatever you're going to do, like, be productive with it. It's like, it's very open-ended to, like, what the motivations or the goals that are going to be accomplished with the cloak are, which I thought was an interesting touch. And then we get to see Harry's parents here. And, of course, she was a very pretty woman. Of course, Harry's mom was pretty. She had to be pretty. Like, she couldn't have been, homely looking or ugly. Like, that just wouldn't have worked. She had to be a pretty woman. But I guess it is Harry's standard here, and he's a kid, and he's seen his parents for the first time, and he's seen, bits of himself in them, so that's understandable. But still, I thought I would point it out just because it was something I thought of as I read it. In chapter 13, I only have one comment, and it's this part right here after the Quidditch match is over. It's like Dumbledore is just like spontaneously right next to Harry, and then he's like, well done. And then real quietly, nice to see you haven't been brooding about that mirror. Been keeping busy? Excellent. And I know this isn't how it's meant, but to me it just felt very demeaning and confusing. Like, I mean, Harry is seeing his parents. Like, yeah, he's obsessing over the mirror, but also, like, he's never seen them before. Like, cut him a break. And instead, Dumbledore has to be like, it's that adult that comes in and tells you, like, well, you've been, screwing around, you're wasting your time, and glad to see you're keeping up with schoolwork, glad to see you're, being productive and getting things done, and, excellent, very happy to see that. So, I don't know, it just felt like it needed a few more lines, maybe, or to be worded a little bit differently in order to communicate that that's not really the intention, and that Dumbledore is being very sincere, and he's like, no, I'm really happy that, like, you're doing well in school, and that you're finding yourself, like, not too overwhelmed with the tragedies of your life. I mean, that's really what the sentiment is supposed to be about, and I just couldn't really get that from the way that it was conveyed here. In chapter 14, we also have some more gender dynamics that I want to address. The first one is right here, where Hermione says, oh, come on, Hagrid, you might not want to tell us, but you do know, everything that goes around here. And it's like, she says in a warm, flattering voice, and Hagrid's beard twitched, and they could tell he was smiling. It's like, why is Hermione being the person to butter up somebody? Like, what, because she's a girl, and she has to use, like, her feminine charm to, like, she's 11. She's a kid. Like, and that doesn't really seem true of her character anyways, because she's, book smart and very, like, studious. Like usually you don't think of that kind of trope to be paired with, like, flattery. And if she was going to use flattery, she should use it a hell of a lot more often than she does. Like, this is, like, the only instance. From memory of reading the books before, I don't recall Hermione ever, exercising a lot of this kind of, like, flattering, use charisma to, like, get what you want out of somebody. At the end of the day, it really just feels like, she needed to have someone butter up Hagrid, and so she went with Hermione because Hermione's the girl. And it just seemed like a huge character break for me. I mean, I could see Ron doing that more realistically, because Ron is the type of person who would say something like, like, oh, let's talk it up, let's try to play that game a little bit, and get excited. Like, he's more in tune with those kinds of energies. I don't know, it's just odd. There's also another character break here where they're in Hagrid's hut and it gets really hot, and then Harry says, Hagrid, can we have a window open? I'm boiling. And so it's a complaint, right? I mean, it's a minor complaint, but a complaint nonetheless. And I really just felt like Ron should have been saying this, because Harry has been living with the Dursleys his whole life. Like, you don't complain with the Dursleys because, you get yelled at, you get beat on, you get locked up in the cupboard. Like, Harry doesn't complain. Like, he's just grateful for what he does get. But Ron, I mean, I can totally see Ron complain. I mean, Ron complains all the time, so it would make perfect sense to have him do that here. So, I don't know. I don't want to say, like, Ron should be doing everything in the place of other characters, but of the three, Ron is far more developed, and his utility makes more sense in these instances. So I just thought it was weird that Harry was the one to say this. Now, I don't want to do this too often, but I am going to go back to Chapter 1 to point out something that's now relevant here. So in Chapter 1, Mr. Dursley, he kisses Dudley on the cheek, and he's not able to do it because Dudley is, like, throwing a tantrum. He's throwing his cereal, and then Dudley says, little tyke, toward Mr. Dursley as he left the house, and it's kind of, he's like, oh, that just little tyke, he's cute or whatever, and he's feisty, and it's like, and he's completely oblivious to the fact that, like, no, this kid's throwing a temper tantrum, this is a bad kid, like, and he's exhibiting a lot of bad behaviors. Well, now we're seeing the same thing, but instead of Dudley and Mr. Dursley, we're seeing it with Norbert and Hagrid. Isn't he beautiful, said Hagrid, and he reaches out and just strokes the dragon's head, and it snaps his fingers at him, showing pointed fangs. And then, and it's just interesting. It's interesting that on one scenario, you see, the jolly, because even Mr. Dursley and Hagrid, they do look alike in the sense that they're both, like, big, rounded characters. They're both, like, teddy bears. But Mr. Dursley is, like, the evil one. And Hagrid is the very nice one. And they're very, like, black and white in that regard. And I get this scene is different. Like, when it is with Hagrid, it is going to be good. And when it's with Mr. Dursley, it is going to be bad. But it's just to show that the characters sometimes fall into these really stock definitions in Harry Potter books, and this one in particular, and this is a prime example of it, because it's not dynamic. Like, in real life, Mr. Dursley does have a few redeeming qualities, and in real life, Hagrid has a few things about him that we wouldn't like so much, but the book doesn't want to paint that picture. It wants it to be very stark. So, I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. I don't have too much more to say about it. I don't think it's neither really bad nor good, but I do think it's a point to mention where you have, like, the same symbology play out, but you want an entirely different meaning attached to it in one scenario versus the other. So if it's up to you to decide if it works for you. I think for most people it does. For me, I noticed it, and it doesn't disrupt my reading, but it just kind of caught my attention, and I was like, I don't really know how I feel about that. Other than that, I can't get the comparison out of my head now, and I feel like they're too easy to cross the two characters over, and that seems worrisome on some level. Like, it seems like it should play out later on in the books, and Hagrid would, like, turn into Dursley, and then Harry would have, like, some resentment to him, or Harry would just think Hagrid is becoming like Mr. Dursley or acting like Mr. Dursley, but Harry, like, never really makes that association as far as I remember, but I guess we'll find out as we proceed. If you wanted to make that connection, though, this would be a great way to establish evidence to build into that. And then lastly, this part here in the chapter, it says, they get Norbert up and they free him, and then, Hermione did a sort of jig. I don't see her doing that either. Maybe I have a complete misinterpretation of, like, who Hermione is as a character, but I just don't see her doing that. That seems like something another character would do. Just it seems out of place. Like, I can kind of just a jig. Like, I mean, I know what she's doing, but it just doesn't feel like something she would do. It just wouldn't look like that. I wouldn't describe it that way. More like she would, like, put her hands together and, like take in a deep breath and be, like, all excited, or, like, kind of, like, rub up against Harry or something, like, just very gently, very, like, briefly for just a moment, because she would be, like, timid, because, like I mean, if your head's in books all the time, you're timid to these kind of, physical social interactions, presumably. I mean, that's not always the case, certainly not, but especially when we're working with especially when we're working with stock characters, and they're not entirely stock, but there's a good deal of that at play here. I mean, we just pointed it out with Hagrid and Mr. Dursley. So if we're doing that kind of style, then I really feel like something different is warranted here. Chapter 15, The Forbidden Forest. Didn't have much to say about this one. Liked it. Good chapter. Moving on. First, I'd like to point out that Hagrid is executed real well here. In general, Hagrid and Ron, I would argue, are the best characters in the book, and Dumbledore. Those three, I think, are executed better than anybody else. And this is a good moment with Hagrid here, where he's like, might have come up? Yeah, he asked what I did, and told him I was gamekeeper here. He asked a bit about the sort of creatures I look after, so I told him. And it's like, it feels so much like something Hagrid would say. Like, only Hagrid would say it this way, so it's very nice. When it comes to these first few parts with Fluffy and the harp, and then also the Devil's Snare, I think I like the film version a little bit better. It's kind of weird to have one of the characters playing a flute. Just kind of, I don't know. I mean, I kind of, it does make me think of the original Zelda, where you get the flute in Dungeon 5, I think it was. I'm just mentioning that because it's like, it's also a fantasy, and you play a kid, and there's all this adventure, and so a kid playing a flute, or like you think of Chronicles of Narnia and Mr. Thomas, and he plays it's a flute, it's a flute or something like that. I don't quite remember, but like I like the way the film handled it. I think it made overall more sense. I guess it doesn't make more sense in the film, because why would the harp still be playing? But it does wear off in the movie too, so it's like it was on a timer. Like they just came in right behind Quill, so I don't know. And this part here where she uses fire to get the Devil's Snare to break apart, and in the movie she uses light. And light seemed like it made more sense because it's called Devil's Snare. It's a plant. Plants typically like daylight, but because you have the devil title in there, it's like, a dark plant. It's like an alternate plant, like a dark world plant is what I'm trying to say. And so light, something that should be beneficial to it, that it should enjoy, it recoils from, and that seemed to make a lot of sense to me. And fire, plants don't like fire ever. Like fire is something I would have just tried. Even if I wasn't, a wizard, I would have just been like, well, yeah, let's just cast some fire on it. Just burn the plants. Like, they'll burn, then they'll move, right? Like, doesn't that just make good sense? So I thought, like, because it had this Devil's Snare title, and it's supposed to be like a magic plant of some sort, I was like, come on, it should be something a little bit more complicated or dynamic than just, throw some fire at it. And now we come to the final chapter, The Man with Two Faces, and I think it'll be clear what my issue is with this chapter after I read a few lines, so listen to this. "You!" gasped Harry. "Me," he said calmly. "I wondered whether I'd be meeting you here, Potter. But I thought Severus. Yes, Severus does seem the type, doesn't he? So useful to have him swooping around like an overgrown bat next to him who would suspect poor stuttering Professor Quill. Harry couldn't take it in. This couldn't be true. It couldn't. But Snape tried to kill me. No. I tried to kill you. You let the troll in. Certainly, I have a special gift with trolls. You must have seen what I did to the one in the chamber back there, because we didn't forget about that. Now, wait quietly, Potter. Need to examine this interesting mirror. Let me speak to him face to face. Master, you are not strong enough. I have strength enough for this. Don't be a fool, snarled the face. Better save your own life and join me, or you'll meet the same end as your parents. They died begging me for mercy. Liar! Never! Seize him! Seize him! Seize him! Master, I cannot hold him! My hands! My hands! Ah! Kill him! Kill him! It's just so much. Like, oh my god. It's... I don't even know. I'm not gonna say anything. It gets the job done. It covers the information, but... oh man. It's just... And the reason I don't feel bad, making a little bit of a mockery of it now is that in future books, this is handled a lot better. But it's a back and forth thing. Like, some of the books do it really well, some of the books don't. And this first entry just makes it very apparent that you're reading a kid's book, a book designed for kids. And it for me, really hurts my immersion. Like, the writing is just so far off the deep end. And the thing about it is, I get it. Like, I'm sure she had a blast writing that. I would have too. In fact, I would have gone even further. I would have been like, oh, what else could he do? Like, just like to make it just as over the top and cliched as I could possibly make it. Just what the hell? Like, it's the first book. I've done everything else to make you, won over by it. Like, if you're not won over by the last scene, just forget it. Like, I'm just gonna go crazy. I'm gonna put it all out there, and we can get serious down the road. I mean, he's 11 years old. Harry is, so there's plenty of time to mature the books as we progress. If anything, this is a good strategy because it sets everyone up to be like, oh, these are nice kids' book, and then when you get into the later ones, you can really up that maturity levels. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the other books as well. Oh my god. Seize him! Let's talk, let's move on. Let's move on. Alright, so, we have Rowling's death talk with kids. But it's a pretty good one. I especially like the end. The trouble is humans do, this is Dumbledore speaking, so, the trouble is humans do have a knack of choosing precisely those things that are worst for them. Well said, Dumbledore, well said. And then it's immediately followed by Dumbledore saying, alas, the first thing you ask me, I cannot tell you. And it just goes back to what he did earlier, where he's like, he's withholding information. And it's like, come on, man. Like, why? What, is it because he's a kid? And it's not even like, because the question Harry is asking is like, why would Voldemort want to kill me in the first place? It's like, couldn't you give him just something of a reason? Like, oh, he thought you would become a powerful wizard and, be a challenge. Like, isn't that a good enough reason to give him now? Like, you can tell him, like, well, I can't share everything right now, or there's a lot to it, but for right now, how about this? Like, just give me something. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like that's a way better way to approach kids than just, like, flat out, like, oh, I can't tell you that. Like, that's off limits, not for you. You're too young. And, like, I don't know, maybe other people disagree, but it just rubbed me the wrong way. And, of course, we've got to get at least one more candy reference in there, because we haven't had quite enough. Like, there hasn't, as if we haven't been bombarded enough throughout this book with references to candy and sweets every chapter. We got to get it in there last minute, but at least this time, it's earwax, so not very tasty. I'll give it that. Oh, I will, said Harry, and they were surprised at the grin that was spreading over his face. They don't know we're not allowed to use magic at home. Could have a lot of fun with Dudley this summer. Until you read book 2 and find out it really was a terrible summer, but, alas, that is for another day. I don't know that I have too many thoughts to say about the narrative overall until I start reading future installments and get into more compare and contrast. As it stands, this first entry does what any first book should, establish the world, the major characters, and the stakes. But among Harry Potter books, this is my least favorite entry, and I don't think that's going to change. It's held back by too many juvenile concerns, and it isn't able to showcase Rowling at her finest since foreshadow works best when the book is longer, or even better, when it capitalizes on setups from previous entries in the series. It's a good book, but it's pretty underwhelming on reread. I'm already having a lot more fun with Chamber of Secrets, though, which is next on the list for Nitpick. So I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.